I do have a new book coming out. It's called The Children's Crusade, and this is what we call an ARC, which is an advanced reader's copy. And I am going to do my very first reading from this book tonight. I'm going to read from the beginning, so I don't need to set anything up. And thanks for listening in advance. Like I said, the title of the book is The Children's Crusade, and it's in 10 parts, and I'm reading from the first part, which is called California Live Oak. Bill Blair received his discharge from the Navy on a September morning in 1954. He'd served on hospital ships off Incheon and Busan, Korea for 2 years, and then completed his service at the Oak Knoll Naval Hospital, a cluster of wooden barracks on a grassy hillside in Oakland, California. On the afternoon of his discharge, he borrowed a convertible and headed across the Bay Bridge, an unplanned adventure that seemed like just the ticket for a fellow with some time on his hands. The sky was the same lovely shade of blue as the hyacinths in the bridal bouquet at his sister's wedding 4 months earlier. He'd gotten a weekend's leave and made it home to Michigan in time for a pre-wedding family breakfast at which his years of service were so celebrated that the very thing he'd sought from the trip, a return to the life he'd known before open wounds and gangrenous limbs and amputations, slipped finally and irrevocably out of his grasp. Outside the church, he stood with his parents in his dress blues and felt as lonely as he ever had in his life. He'd first seen San Francisco from the deck of the USS Haven under a sky choked with clouds. Now, as he drove, he found himself drawn less to the bright downtown than to the low-lying hills beyond it, beribboned with candy-colored houses. He stayed on the highway, heading for the next set of hills, and soon he was moving alongside the Pale Bay, approaching the airport. Seagulls swooped out of the sky, tiny icons of the aircraft landing on the tarmac. This was the first convertible he'd ever driven, and despite all his time at sea, he'd never had quite such a confrontation with the wind. His face was pummeled, his hair blown flatter than the bunk of an enlisted man. Up ahead of him, on the prow of the car, the noble, brave Pontiac bore down on the unknown with an attitude of calm determination. Leaving the bay shore, Bill pointed the chrome Indian westward and drove through neighborhoods of brand new houses that seemed like decoys for something marvelous he would discover soon. Twisting past a golf course, he entered a grove of pines. Narrow roads split off and disappeared around curves and up hills. On an impulse, he followed one of these, winding among low-hanging branches with leaves like tiny silver spears. The road leveled off, and a path beckoned him to leave the car and make his way to a clearing where a magnificent oak tree stood guard. He was the grandson of a farmer on his mother's side and a doctor on his father's, both third-generation Michiganders. As a boy, he'd expected a life like that of his father, the doctor's son, who'd gone to work at a local bank and was now president and chairman of the board, a man who dressed in a suit and tie every day and had the house painted biannually because it was important to keep up appearances. Bill's mother was an exemplary housekeeper, using vinegar to make the windows sparkle and bleach to keep the bed sheets bright on the line. Bill had grown up believing virtue was a ticket to contentment, but the war had exploded that notion, and he needed something to replace it. The oak was the most splendid tree he'd ever seen, its gnarled branches snaking every which way. He would learn later that it was a California live oak, species Quercus agrifolia, or sharp-leaved oak, and the ground beneath it was carpeted with curled, brittle leaves and peculiar elongated acorns. An idea had been forming during his last months of service that his skills and training could be adapted toward a type of medicine that might over time supplant his memories of men blown open with bodies that wouldn't be subjected to such violence, the bodies of children. He would have to do a second residency in pediatrics, but he did not mind the idea of deferring his work life for a few more years. A period of preparation more or less equal to the number of months he'd given the Navy might in some way cancel that experience and return him to the confidence and optimism he felt on the day he received his sheepskin from the University of Michigan Medical School, the best he could hope for now that his family had mistaken him for a hero. He surveyed the land in front of him and slipped into a reverie in which he was surrounded by children, dozens of them, darting between trees, throwing balls, jumping in leaf piles, calling "Ollie, Ollie, oxen free," more children than he could father himself, but not nearly as many as he could help. With the assistance of a gift from his father, he put a down payment on the 3.1 acres surrounding the oak tree against a total purchase price that would be laughable a few decades later when the value of the land had increased by a factor of 300. He had no funds left to build anything on the property, and for the next couple of years he saw it only rarely, when he could steal time from the 18-hour days and 80-hour weeks at UCSF. From his paternal grandfather, he had inherited a 1935 Hamilton Sechron dual-dial doctor's watch. Throughout the war, he'd used the second hand to measure the pulse of the injured men he treated, and the habit had stayed with him, so that when the watch stopped working during rounds one morning, he found time the very next day to take it to be repaired. Reliable Clock and Watch was on Cole Street, a cramped shop with a battered swing counter dividing the entry area from the cash register and the workbench, each of which was occupied. The bench by a bespectacled, balding man wearing a blue butcher's apron over a white shirt and tie, and the counter by a slender, gawky girl with messy dark hair and a cameo pin fastened to her blouse. The girl was Penny Greenway, and the man was her uncle, a bachelor who'd invited his sister's daughter to come from her home in Sacramento to work for him in exchange for room and board and $25 a week. Penny had been with him for 6 months, and along with a little bookkeeping and a few rudimentary dishes to serve him for dinner, she'd learned that time was not just a property of physics, but also a receptacle for loneliness. Bill had the air of a hurried businessman, and she was surprised when he went to the trouble of explaining that he was a doctor and needed the second hand for his work. He smiled and waited while she peered at the face of the watch, and she was struck by the way his hurry seemed to vanish, replaced by a kind, keen patience. Her uncle came forward from the repair bench and looked the watch over, frowning in his characteristic way, and she felt an urge to reassure the man that his watch would be right as rain again. Instead, she pulled out a ticket and asked him for his address, and she blushed when he said he lived just around the corner in an upstairs apartment from the coffee shop where she took her break every afternoon. He said his clothes smelled of hamburger grease, but the rent was cheap and he hadn't cooked a meal in over a year. A few days later, they ran into each other at the coffee shop. "Now we'll see each other all the time," he said, as he held the door for her, and she said, "Though until you have your watch back, it'll be hard to measure." It took him a moment to react, and she liked the way his plain brown eyes narrowed briefly and then widened again as he smiled. She had never liked a boy, and the kisses she'd seen on movie screens suggested the whole business would require more hot breath than she could tolerate. In her experience, men smelled like soap in the morning, and it went downhill from there. Her uncle smelled worse than her father, probably because of the cigars he smoked after dinner. Every night, he sat in the parlor that looked onto Terrible Street and smoked his cigar and listened to polka music on the hi-fi. He kept time on the arm of his chair, boom da-da, drumming with his palm until Penny had to leave the room so she wouldn't scream. She wondered what it would be like to have Bill Blair sitting in the chair instead. She imagined he would have a lot of interesting things to say.